Recently, I have received an email from academia.edu saying an AI created a podcast of your paper. After agreeing reluctantly to the terms, I was facing a podcast accompanied by a note private to you. The podcast itself, however, did not play back. By reloading the page a couple of times, the title of my co-authored paper was uttered as part of the beginning of a podcast, as if eloquently spoken by some director of the academia organization. Again, the controls did not allow me to repeat the opening part, and therefore I cannot remember the name. The Google quickly finds a page related to this phenomenon, and we see that the user's responses are not favorable. For the purpose of this paper, two interesting aspects can be identified. First, the users generally dislike automatic remixing of their scholarly papers without being asked to opt in, since sharing of articles on academia.edu is primarily aimed at human readers, students and researchers, as well as search engines. Less widespread is the acceptance for authors' texts being used in training deep neural network models. Thus far, this is a case similar to intrusiveness of the AI assistant in Acrobat Reader that proposes chat with your documents to summarize contents and, for instance, create teaching materials for classes on and using novels that you open in their PDF form. Or the WhatsApp chat that invites the user to chat alongside her actual human acquaintances, also with an artificial agent called Meta AI, by adding a prominent button and screens somehow awkward to get out of, in my experience. In short, what is concerning is that AI, artificial intelligence, is spamming our communication and exhausting individuals' cognitive energies, as well as intruding into our property and personal data. On the other hand, it is interesting that the trusted repository idea as part of the well-known open science paradigm and its fair, and accessible, interoperable and reusable principles embraced by the European Union and UNESCO are in the first place focused on data being machine actionable. That is to say, data and metadata for machines, which of course means artificial intelligence data processing use, as well as pursuing a more general goal of following common standards and ontologies to make scientific research more open. Here, to the contrary, the open access for machine-supported acquisition processing is a programmatic goal. The second point of view, therefore, sees the fragility of the artificial, the data, agents and artifacts. The agents break down, even disappear. An example is the disappearance of the Lyre augmented reality platform with its mobile browser. It had been improving for years, since 2009, and after the technology was integrated surprisingly well into operating systems on iPhones and Android smartphones, the service was suddenly shut down for economic reasons in 2018. It was widespread. I remember, for instance, noticing some Slovenian wine bottles having links to AR content online. In such cases, a digital intangible cultural heritage practice is getting lost, and it is currently, as a rule, not being adequately preserved. An extreme case of perceiving concrete artificial agents, which are technical artifacts, with an attitude of compassion, are the reported reactions to videos of ticking dog-like robots that can trigger sympathy in viewers, similar to the one towards sentient beings. Is the projection of personality onto, for instance, a doll completely misguided, or do technical artifacts possess an intrinsic ethical value? Is such an attitude viable, ethically acceptable? Does it even make sense? So this presentation will consist of two parts. First, an attempt to exhibit again a born digital art piece by Vuk Ćosić that was linked to a specific technological media historical context will be presented. The changes between its two states or versions separated by 2 decades will be emphasized. In the theoretical second part, the paper will point towards a framework for possible ways of ethically evaluating the communicative exchanges involving humans, groups, and artificial as well as hybrid entities. The idea of shifting the focus from individuals towards networked environments is the reason for focusing on ecology instead of ways of conceptualizing an individual agent through egology. The shift from individual self-enclosedness towards understanding also humans as permeable areas of the all-encompassing informational environment, the infosphere, can, for instance, be imagined in the context of avant-garde and new media practices that socialize, that is to say, educate, and therefore constitutively transform the participants in a communication event. Here, the ethics of Infosphere by Luciano Floridi are key reference. So, in 2022, the Museum of Contemporary Art Metelkova presented the exhibition based on a new media art installation from 2000, Nation Culture by Vuk Ćosić. This complex and multifaceted work by an internationally acclaimed author was selected for acquisition and presentation by the Museum of Modern Art in Ljubljana because it represents an early, credible example of machine-based creativity, which involves Slovene language. The first embodiment of the project was closely linked to communication and mass media environment in Slovenia around the year 2000, as the project sourced text from the live search stream from the then main Slovene portal to the World Wide Web, Matkuria. The unfiltered queries were anonymously presented in the shape of a sonnet on a projection using historical typography and script. In 2025, an all-eloquent AI deep network is inconspicuous. The project was, however, realized and presented by Ćosić and his programmer Marko Plahuta more than a month before the global public release of ChatGPT. That is to say, still in an era where computer-based literature was based on permutations and montage techniques, on remixing, and its examples, as a rule, subverted everyday practices of human verbal communication. The 2022 version introduced 3 levels of necessary modification to the project from 2000. In the exhibition occurring in the wake of the cultural and political disruptions triggered and exacerbated by the COVID-19 epidemic and its social distancing recommendations, the project targeted the then ruling right-wing government thematically. It included the name of the Minister of Culture into the expanded project title. Also, the Twitter community and its abusive and insensitive style of communication, as it was predominant in Slovenia in general, was addressed critically. The second level is the technical solution for building an algorithm that creates textual artifacts that readers can read and are able to make some sense of. The insight into the hidden sequence of voices using the search engine of the web directory from 2000, long gone in 2022, was then replaced by a deep neural network output, a model with the GPT-2 architecture, which was trained on tweets in Slovenian and some additional Slovene text corpora from the media. The third level of change was that the features of the first version of the project were distributed between several parts of the installation. The installation setup therefore consisted of 3 parts called the people, the leader, and the pantheon. As an author's nod to the conceptualist art practices, the work's reconstruction was designed referencing anthropological research, which was emphasized on the 4th wall that displayed the title of the show and playful explanatory texts. The people part consisted of 14 vertical light-emitting diode screens, LED screens, with flowing Petrarchan sonnets linked to particular themes, work, education, and so on. The animation of words replacement from the work version in 2000 was represented by a similar animation, displaying thematically similar tweets instead of contingent search queries. The classifications of tweet previously collected by Marko Plahuta, was based on supervised learning method developed for news classification. Tweets, and before that news titles, are assigned relevant categories from an array of 100 themes. A different technical solution was used for the second and third part, the creation of sonnets using the GPT-2 type transformer generative AI in the pattern and the leader segments. The leader consisted of AI-generated responses to tweets by the then Prime Minister that were published on Twitter as a response from dedicated user account. The pattern was a series of 14 printed sonnets that responded to tweets by right-wing politicians. The visitors could take tear-offs from bounce text on the wall. In both cases, the first verse or the initial part of the newly created sonnet was the tweet, which was used as a prompt. So the 3 parts of the project emphasize 3 aspects of new media language. The distinction between supervised and unsupervised learning, the latter being an open and exploratory type of machine learning, is relevant for understanding the people part. Are the pre-selected categories from the training set with the accompanying biases a restrictive and damaging element in the context of communication as a whole? Next, the issues with being able to publish information on and link to Twitter accounts and the questions of authority to speak online allows us to reflect on the difference between a single-user cybertext, where one is facing an inflexible rule-based institution, and a multi-user discourse that in principle allows numerous participants to act in a social network situation also not without its own issues. This aspect of new media communication is touched upon in the leader. For this paper, the most interesting part is the new mechanism for creating sonnets using a generative AI with a foundational model that is subsequently used to do something particular, such as writing sonnets. Plahuta trained his own foundational transformer model and then fine-tuned it with examples of poetry to output sonnets. What has happened communication-wise? One approach is to view the communication in the project with versions from 2000 and 2022 as a dialogue between different people, or different people in particular roles as part of social groups. From such a point of view, it is possible to identify a substantial shift at the core of the project. In 2002, the Twitter platform and its Slovene language users with the tweets are the source database for building the sonnets. In 2002, this role was filled by website visitors searching for Slovene web content. So, we have like 2 versions. Let's look closer at these social network participants in the year 2022, so the new version. For Ćosić, they seem to be distinctly angry, abusive, and also unhappy or anxious. Not all of them in particular and in general, but specifically as participants in Twitter, they most likely are. At least in Slovenia, where this platform was associated with political discourse. Presented schematically, there are isolated users that start as unhappy, and they grow even more miserable by discussing in a format traditionally limited to 140 or 280 characters. So that's top right of the diagram. Also, a general issue with the communication using social platforms is the loss of the utterer's control over what is said. That is to say, what the addressee sees on her screen, the post with additional information selected by the platform. This is an even more pronounced feature on YouTube or Facebook. The posts on social networks, of course, become training data for AI models after being commercialized first in their raw form. All this necessarily leads to dissatisfaction and unhappiness of the users, first directly, then indirectly by experiencing abuse of their content and their work. The resentful utterance from Twitter is then used in nation culture as the first verse or part of a newly generated sonnet, graphically marked by italic script. So that's top left. And next I will present the bottom right part of the diagram. The incipit is followed by the second part of the sonnet. Here a deep neural network first learns its weights from a set of recorded utterances. Because of the usually big data like sizes of trading corpora, it makes sense to take the speakers as neutral regarding their satisfaction with communicative outcomes and progress. Some utterances were created in a context that allows the flourishing of the speakers, some were retorts to maltreatment and repression, some were value neutral. The data set is then fed into a training process which subsequently produces a black box entity. These are weights in a neural network model that produces the final larger part of the sonnet. In 2000, while using search stream from Matt Kurias for the first presentation of the work, the situation of interlocutors was different. A person in need of an answer, this is a person with a problem, anxiously seeking an answer, is faced with a search window on a web portal and lives, in principle, satisfied with an answer. The situation is almost diametrically opposed to the Twitter situation. While interacting with Matkuria in the early days of the World Wide Web, people pass from misery to happiness. In 2002, voices present in Chosic's projection remain miserable. In such a cultural climate, it is not unexpected to mention as an aside that a somehow dismissive critique emerged, namely questioning the integrity of the Nation Culture Project by problematizing whether in 2002 exhibition it is a different project, which it could be according to traditionalist part of a museum community. Or this is a case of a lasting existence of a single digital conceptual entity in transformations alongside the temporal axis and relating to new contexts of mass media and communication technologies. Such a traditionalist skepticism, however, misses the point regarding the ethical issues that consider the reality as an all-encompassing infosphere. So, to conclude with the short outlook onto the second part, the ethics of infosphere as an extension of environmental ethics. For instance, the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy is a born digital artifact. It exists on the internet while being used and co-created and managed by a community of experts and professionally interested parties. It was never a book, a first edition. It was deliberately constructed as a sustainable community project online, a scholarly dynamic reference work. Like nation culture, it changes in time, has its period of being incomplete, its challenges to continue. It is a born digital engineered artifact which has its own intrinsic value that our culture decided to acknowledge and protect. Consider, for instance, the ICOM Code of Ethics for Museums that targets human-made artifacts as ethical patients. Environmental ethics is a field where attempts are being made to expand the framework of moral action and ethical principles beyond the limits of the human. Ethical consideration expands from the Kantian focus on humans and gradually includes sentient beings, living nature, and then also inanimate nature. The environment, in the sense of a non-human entity, gains an independent ethical value. An important distinction for environmental ethics is between intrinsic and extrinsic, that is, instrumental value, which is usually value for humans. To quote from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, it is commonly agreed that something possesses an intrinsic value, that this generates a prima facie direct moral duty on the part of moral agents to protect it, or at least refrain from damaging it. Many traditional Western perspectives, however, are human-centered in that either they assign intrinsic value to human beings alone, or they assign a significantly greater amount of intrinsic value to human beings. The environmental ethics is the starting point for Luciano Floridi's Ethics of Information, which is part of his project on the philosophy of information. Here's one of his thought experiments. Imagine a boy playing in a dumping ground. Nobody ever comes to the place. Nobody ever uses anything, nor will anyone ever wish to do so. There are many old cars abandoned there. The boy entertains himself by breaking their windscreens and lights, skillfully throwing stones at them. He enjoys himself enormously. Yet, most of us would be inclined to suggest that he should entertain himself differently, that he ought not to play such a destructive game, and that his behavior is not just morally neutral, but is positively depreciable, though perhaps very mildly so when compared to serious mischiefs. Floridi rejects arguments from the points of view of biocentric ethics, since the cars are not living beings, or by pointing to environmental issues. Also from consequentialism, which will be represented in the second column in this diagram, deontologism, deontological ethics, the first column, and the virtue ethics, the third column. The quote here refers to a part of the fourth column. So I quote from Luciano Floridi's Ethics of Information. We come then to the information ethics, and we know immediately why the boy's behavior is a case of blameworthy vandalism. He is not respecting the objects for what they are, and his game is only increasing the level of entropy in the dumping ground pointlessly. Here it's important to point out that this key concept means metaphysical entropy, not to be equated with the entropy from physics, which Floridi points out. It's basically referring to a reduction of information, impoverishment of the informational environment. So, to continue the quote, it is his lack of care, the absence of consideration for the object's sake, that we find morally blamable. He ought to stop destroying bits of the infosphere and show more respect for what is naturally different from himself and yet similar as an information entity to himself. He ought to employ his time more constructively. In conclusion, I cannot extensively elaborate on the diagram, and let me finish with the proposal to treat humans as regions of infosphere, not considering a person as isolated ego, but through the prism of ecology of the infosphere. Homo poeticus, as the embodiment of constructionism, is ecopoetic, carefully constructing regions of the infosphere. Floridi reviews various options in favor of opening the flow of information and its restriction, as well as, for example, considering a pair of persons as a system of several agents. The self can thus be understood as an information microenvironment with centers, peripheries, which is not impermeable and which is changing. Thank you.